Perfect. Well, thanks to everybody who's joined today. As we were just commenting, I'm here at our headquarters in Durham, North Carolina. So I'm in my office. Everyone else is in the lab today. But really excited to take the time to talk through some of my thoughts around creating a just and sustainable food system with cellular agriculture. I hope it doesn't sound too soapboxy. I hope you'll forgive me as being a recent nominee in social impact and entrepreneurship, which is where my focus and passion is. That this is not a rebuke of our sector or industry at all. It's looking at the potential that we have if we really adjust our thinking and are much more thinking about others rather than just ourselves. So with that, I'm going to dive right in on some of my thesis, which I'm excited for the conversation and discussion afterwards because you can challenge me on some of these. But it's my belief we have a responsibility as leaders of food innovation and global citizens and as human beings for the following 4 areas as founders of companies or as participants in cellular agriculture. That's to understand our roles within the global problem-solving network, to integrate social impact in our business plans from the start. That means not just waiting until we can get the cost down, but really thinking about what the implications of our plans are, to make sustainable business decisions in everything that we do, and to create mission-aligned partnerships throughout the work that we create. I'm going to go through some dire and sad statistics first, as we all like to start these presentations, and then I'll go to the upside. And for me, that starts with our world's experiencing unprecedented levels of extinction. We obviously saw in the last year or so deforestation being a huge driver in the Amazon of extinction, and continue to see thousands of species of frogs going extinct each year. We see animal domestication continuing to be an issue here in North Carolina. About 1 time a year, we get a black bear that enters a local town and has to be put down because they become too accustomed to people being close to them, eating out of trash cans, situations that we see because of continuing domestication. Animal husbandry practices encroaching on the habitats naturally seen to these types of animals. And finally, poaching. Rhinos are always an example that everybody wants to talk about when talking about poaching. And for us, we look at about 73% increased consumption of meat by 2050, 50% increased consumption by dairy, according to FAO. And so it's not surprising that we're seeing these unprecedented levels of extinction because people are trying to find other food sources and are trying to create more food for our growing population and world. We also look at the oceans then, right? We're losing land, we're losing animals on the land. And so we look to the water, our lifeblood of the planet. And I think we can all agree that it's acidifying and decaying. Right now, we have huge levels of plastic waste, plastic floating islands, overfishing that I don't have to tell many of the people on this call about in depth of how incredibly overfished our oceans are and how little we actually know about what species are being delivered to final consumers. We see toxic greenhouse gases contributing to this acidification cycle and chemical waste flowing directly into our oceans. We know that right now seafood contributes to about 15% of the average animal consumption of protein to about 2.9 billion people in our world. That means for most of that protein consumption, greater than 50% of it's occurring on small islands in Southeast Asia or parts of Western Africa, where there really aren't other animal sources of protein. There might be some plants, but in some of those regions, we see drought and we see other challenges from climate change causing the growth of plants as an indicator or filler from protein, really not a possibility long-term. And so, as everyone does when they're hungry, they turn to the nearest food source they have, which is the ocean. We're seeing incredible amounts of fishing occurring, and the main sustaining force of diets in many of these parts of the world is coming from fish protein. So when we talk about the tragedy of the commons, kind of a classic economic principle, it's unsurprising that we're seeing both nation states and individuals being unwilling to put limits around overfishing, limits around vessel size, and limits around general use of the ocean. No one person owns the ocean, which is a positive thing for our world, but it means no one entity, organization, or institution can take true representation for our ocean, and we all suffer the consequences of that. It's the classic discussion where you're thinking about basically nobody sees the ramifications every day of their actions and therefore doesn't make any changes because of it. And so because that plastic bottle in your hand, maybe you only drink once a week when you're out of the house and you don't want to use something that has to be taken back or forth, doesn't seem like a big deal. But it ends up in our oceans, and it is a big deal, and no one takes responsibility for it on a daily basis. And then finally, the topic that most warms my heart and is most important to me is that our children can't grow to their full potential. We see the promotion of unhealthy foods. About $1.3 trillion are spent by lower income consumers throughout the world on foods that we would consider low nutritional quality. So we're talking instant noodles, packaged unflattened breads, crackers, cookies, things that while they may fill your stomach, they don't nourish your body. And it's typically $1.3 trillion is about 500 times the nutritional aid given out in the world annually. meaning that consumers are spending more than they're actually receiving in help and assistance at the fact when they're eating these meals that aren't actually nourishing their bodies. Poverty, of course, is a continuing issue that goes with the potential of children. We see the discouragement of breastfeeding, mothers who are convinced that bovine-based infant formula are better for them, better for their children, when they really just line the pockets of big corporations. And finally, we see a lack of education and an inability to find opportunity in many rural areas throughout the world. We can all agree that these SDGs combat extinction, climate change, life below water, life on land. We can agree that these ones mostly protect our oceans, clean water and sanitation, sustainable cities and community, peace and justice. And sometimes these ones get to the root of hunger. Not always, but sometimes. We talk a lot about gender inequality, reduced inequalities, affordable and clean energy sources. So what more can we do? We've identified all these SDGs. We all pick a few that we put on our website and say, hey, our work in Cell Ag goes to X. I work on 2, 4, and 7, right? But at the end of the day, I love this quote from Sean Baker, he's now the chief nutritionist at USAID and the past Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation director of nutrition, which was solve number 2 and you solve them all. It was his thesis and the thesis that I'm going to utilize today, which is that if you can solve zero hunger, if you can solve the problem of hunger for most people in this world, everything else in part will solve themselves. Hunger is such a driver in what we see in so many other facets, and we get to have an outsized impact on hunger in the future, but we can't ignore it for the other SDGs that maybe seem more relatable or seem flashier or seem easier to solve. When number 2, zero hunger, is one of the hardest, but is also one of the most fundamental to be able to create lasting change for both humans on this planet and the planet at large. I've identified kind of 4 root causes that I think are really important to talk about when we look at across all of the SDGs. And for me, that's changing education levels, both for the better and worse. We see more people becoming more educated, which means they're seeking more opportunity. They're looking for ways to make money. They're looking for opportunities outside of what someone in their community maybe had before. And that's both a positive, but also a negative. Not all parts of this world can support opportunity equally in the way that we've currently established our power structures. We see economic inequities, huge, huge growth in many countries considered developing. We're seeing massive amounts of urbanization, growth, opportunity, which is incredibly exciting, but it means that there's higher levels of consumption that these consumers and these nations want to see. And who is it on us and mostly Western nations to say they shouldn't have it because it contributes to climate change? Instead, we have to think about how economic inequities in the future will continue to be balanced amongst nations and amongst people. We see global development, an incredible amount of opportunity in, for instance, just a longer amount of life. We have vaccination cold chains, as we see right now occurring in many parts of the world, expanding. And that's due in part to the advancements of global development, biotechnology, global health, spaces that previously in many countries, you weren't able to live past 35 or 40 years old. And in most of the world, we're getting closer and closer to that metric, if not beyond. It's really exciting to see that. But it all comes down to number 4, in my opinion, which is hunger. If you're hungry, you can't work on basically anything else. You're not going to be even willing to consider the trade-offs for the planet or the people around you if you're starving. And so when we think of kind of Maslow's fundamental needs hierarchy, hunger really underpins a lot of that. And if we can find ways to address hunger, we can really get to the rest of everything else. So for the true hypothesis, as a traditionally trained scientist, I'm going to say that my hypothesis is a multidisciplinary approach to hunger will save our world, and biotech is at the center of that. I see that biotech has an outsized impact in this space, and I'm really excited to give some suggestions and some frameworks of how we think about that in the future. It's always important to note this question, which I get pushed back on from people who are strong climate change agreeers, right? People who believe that we have to do everything to protect the planet and people will have to figure it out. And that's this natural tension of planetary boundaries and humanity. Do people have to be sacrificed to protect the planet or vice versa? Basically, is overpopulation the fundamental issue at hand, and we have to think about how do we protect the planet for future generations, or it won't matter whether or not they exist. And I don't have an answer for that. That's a far more existential and philosophical debate than I'm going to get into today. But I think this is an important and interesting thing to note, which is that when you look at protein consumptions for humans changing over time to 2030, 2050, based on FAO and WHO calculations, we see that there are increasing and changing trends in protein, which I think everyone in this sector understands and knows really well. Thanks to Cellular and other reports too, we've seen the investment that goes into that space. So you look at the first wave of innovation, plant-based, and it's going to be important that plant-based continue to occur. That will enable us to have cheaper sources of protein and nutritious foods, extending to more people more quickly so that we can continue to see the population growth trajectory that we're on without continuing to sacrifice the planet again and again and again. But then we also need other waves of innovation to truly compete. And that's where novel protein, I think the second wave of innovation really is. Fermentation has incredible potential, which as we continue to unlock, I truly believe will have some differential outsized impact on malnutrition, poverty, hunger, and many of these SDGs that we're all focused on. That puts us in the third wave of innovation, in my opinion. And I think it's important to note that this is the third wave that I explicitly put off to the side because I'm not asking any of us to solve these problems today. None of us have the solutions that we need. None of us are particularly equipped yet to solve any of these problems as young, small companies. And so instead, I want to say as a sector, as a third wave of innovation, cellular agriculture can produce any of the sources of protein we put our minds to. And all I'm asking is that we think about how we're doing that sustainably and ethically, and that we start to follow some of these suggestions that I have about how we consider how our businesses fit into a greater landscape. I'm going to give 3 very quick examples here of some of the ways that I think this is really working. So Pembiont, or working or not working. Pembiont is one of the original biofabricated horn companies. I probably don't have to tell many of you about it. Basically, the concept was you can create horns or other biomaterials that would flood the market and shut down the need to hunt endangered species. I'm going to use Pembiont as an example, although I know there are many other companies that have been working on this, mainly because they were one of the earliest one. And they had all kinds of articles that came out around Brave New World, biotechnology for conservation. We see there was lots of excitement in the space and lots of potential flooding into the idea that if we destroy the market for horns, we destroy the fact that we see extinction occurring amongst rhinos. And well, that is a good idea, and they've had some moderate success along the way. They've also had some setbacks. There's a number of countries around the world that continue and actually have reduced restrictions on rhino hunting and horn hunting, including China, Namibia, and other parts of the world that, for a variety of social and cultural context, have decided not to follow suit on some of the endangered species principles that we see. And part of that is that they haven't been engaged appropriately. Saying, hey, we're going to flood the market, it won't matter anymore, gives people kind of an open out, right? It gives them the opportunity to just say, great, somebody else is solving this problem. And that's really not what's going to happen. It's going to require this multidisciplinary approach of using the World Trade Organization, UN, and other nonprofit organizations that are really focused on protecting endangered species. So the example I want to proffer instead is, rather than just saying, we're going to flood the market, it'll relieve some of the pressure, that'll make it better, why don't we look at examples like this particular primary school, which is built on the border of Kruger National Park, which is one of the core areas that elephants and rhinos are currently being extinguished. Basically, the school has been built with conservation practices in mind. And all of these cute little kids that you see on the screen are learning about conservation practices to create tourism and other opportunities for economic increase in the area. It gives us an opportunity to teach the next generation so that, as Dr. Susie Ellis, the ED of the International Rhino Foundation, has said, most poachers are in a high level of poverty and are enticed by a lucrative deal. We have to find them a new deal. So in this way, if we can partner with other organizations and not just focus on one specific biotechnology solution, but instead how all of these players in the network can affect a long-term opportunity, we may actually be able to prevent the extinction of rhinos. My next example is from the fish sector, or cellular fish sector, which there are lots of companies in, many of which I consider close friends and allies. And I'm sure most of you have seen, or if you haven't, go Google it and look, the X Prize Feed the Next Billion challenge that came out last week, which is specifically focused around poultry and fish protein sources at an affordable price point and full fillet form. We see a lot of focus in this space when we get back to thinking about ocean health, because as I pointed out, a huge amount of the population of the world consumes protein basically exclusively coming from fish source. And so Blue Nalu, Wild Type, some of these companies are doing amazing work to make whole flesh fish that is just truly outstanding, but it's still targeted towards a pretty premium market. A lot of these founders have great aspirations in how they think about moving beyond just that premium market. But at the end of the day, we all kind of have this, well, I've got to bring the cost down enough to be able to sell it in San Francisco. And then once I sell it in San Francisco, maybe I'll bring down the cost enough to sell it in Durham, North Carolina. And then someday, maybe I'll bring it down the cost enough to be able to serve it in Bangladesh, right? And while that's a really, awesome opportunity in space, it really is in a vacuum. It makes us think about that we have to be the ones to solve these problems, which I don't really think we do. I think we have to be the collaborators to help solve these problems. So when I look at like a group like Conservation X Labs, which if you're not familiar with, they're also a very cool company. They have this four-point kind of method that they look at for scaling technology solutions so that the founders don't have to support all of these issues or problems themselves. Instead, they can think about how a multidisciplinary approach can really change things. When you look at Conservation X on all of the challenges they've put out there, you see that they harness planetary genius, which many of the founders I would consider already fit here. There's already directed innovation. VCs already see potential and are funding this work. And so now the question where they're able to help is, how do we scale these solutions, and how do you build the tribe of people who are going to support the scaling of these solutions? And you look at nonprofits in spaces specifically for ocean health or for fish, you see a variety of different groups that have already put their money where their mouth is, and they're sponsoring projects for things around, for instance, kelp growing, alternative waste streams to be able to use in food products from other types of algae, seaweed, and things to create economic opportunity in these areas. You look at polyculture farming that's being suggested and utilized for regenerative agriculture in oceans and not just in lands. And we see an incredible amount of innovation for tracking fish species and appropriately pricing those species so that they actually take on the full externalities of their production and harvesting. Tuna are super expensive. There's a lot of bycatch. Somebody better pay the price of that actual piece of tuna that they're getting. So when we look at kind of an ocean action plan, there's lots of cool opportunity. There's MPA governance, which there's a huge amount of development in international NGOs around. Sustainable livelihoods, as I mentioned, where they're using all kinds of different practices to create economic and inspiration in these areas, especially in many of these rural islands we see in Southeast Asia, finding other ways to empower women, to empower economic disparity to be reduced, and to generally just bring up many of the consumers that otherwise would be left behind by our innovations. Of course, there's your classic conservation work, and we see that there's a variety of different technologies being put into the space. And then there's just classic habitat restoration. How do we think about reducing erosion and other destruction of our natural waterways, which is going to be incredibly important as we look to climate change implications long term. I think this is a really cool example. I'm not going to spend much time here, but if you've ever heard about Greenwave, you should go, or if you've never heard of them, you should go look them up. Basically, they have this really cool regenerative model, which it gives empowerment through job training and market access for sustainable change. I think they're a great example of where someone like one of our many biotech seafood companies could look at and find some really interesting inspiration for partnerships. And then finally, Biomilq, because we are not immune to this problem. I'm on my high horse about everybody else, but we have the exact same issue. We're talking about a challenging technology that has huge societal and cultural implications, and we really can't ignore what those are going to be. And so for us, that means empowering the elixir of life beyond our walls of mammary epithelial cells. My team required that I showed you a beautiful holiday-themed photo of our cells because they're very excited about them, and show our tight junctures of how our milk production works. But it really doesn't matter how cool the tech is if we're not able to both inspire trust with parents and with organizations that are encouraging breastfeeding and infant nutrition in our space. So we've been working actively to talk with the Human Milk Banking Organization in North America, working closely and trying to think on how we fit into or challenge the terms of the WHO code and how we be a more responsible company than infant formula companies of the past, which have absolutely advertised inappropriately to consumers directly. How we think about fitting into programs here in the US and beyond about subsidized payments such as WIC, USDA funding here in the US, and other healthcare payer systems around the world. And then how we also think about aligning with organizations that otherwise may not have been our allies, like the Leche League, strong believers in that breastfeeding is best, which we agree. If you can breastfeed, you absolutely should. So how do we encourage parents, mothers, families to be able to continue to breastfeed while having biomilk options out in the world, which gives them the opportunity to continue to have milk at hand as needed to feed their children as healthfully and as long as possible. Now, none of these suggestions that I've given you have told you how we're going to feed babies in rural parts of India, or how we're going to think about getting to one of the highest stunted regions of the world, Nigeria. And to be honest, the answer is, I don't have a solution for that yet. I would love to be able to tell you how I'm immediately going to get into low and middle income countries and get into the hands of parents who need our product most. But it's really hard. And when we talk about trying to just bring down the scale of cost, it's really not enough. So we're working on actively right now, how do we build a business model around some of these partners and more to be able to really bring these products to the people who need them so that we're not just talking a talk, but walking a walk. And I hope that my presentation today will give you some solace in that even if we don't have a solution, people like us at the helm of biotech companies who want to see change with the right guidelines and frameworks could really create the world that we want to see someday. And it's going to require us to think differently, be more creative, and in some ways work a little harder than just raising cash and making a technology come to this world. So I give 4 final statements as a closure to all of this lambasting that I've given the sector and industry, which is to say that we need people-focused solutions for people-focused problems. And that means we need to start conversations and engage with all voices in the room and listen to honest feedback. For us, that means talking about the racial disparities between infant formula and breastfeeding rates, and start to address head on some of the institutional racism barriers here in the US and beyond that really lead to those factors. Sustainability is going to require focusing on long-term impact rather than quick fixes, which means we have to do it right. It's really easy to take VC funding and say, we'll have that product out in 2 years. But at the end of the day, if it only gets into the hands of the wealthy, it's not going to create any of the sustainable change that we want to see. So we really have to think about how our products aren't just scaled down in cost, but are scaled up in impact, and really think about how that impacts both our short-term business models and long-term business models as to how we come into this world. We must conduct thorough market research to understand genuine needs and capabilities. It's right now, for the most part, most of our technologies, we're looking at relatively well-developed markets with high willingness to pay. And well, those markets are the spaces we're going to start first because it's where early adopters are. We can't discount how much interest and excitement other parts of the world and other socioeconomic levels of humanity have for our products. So if there's a need and there's a want, we need to find a way to serve them. Changing behaviors requires consumer-first design. I encourage all of us, long before we're even thinking about commercializing, to go out and do interviews. And not just in your, like, what do you think? Would you buy this? What would you call it? But in a genuine, what's the need state you're in today? Going into a consumer's pantry, walking through how they're making dinner, really thinking about how they're going to use our products differentially to maybe the animal-based products that exist today, and making sure that we don't not only address those pain points, but we're able to absolutely beat them. So that when there's any question, am I willing to pay 10 cents more on the dollar? Yes, because it's a better solution for me, not just a better solution for the planet. And finally, our products can't live in isolation. We say this all the time at Biomilq. To some extent, it doesn't matter how cool or how amazing what we're doing is. If we do it in isolation, no one will want it or believe in it. So we have to work together as a sector, we have to work together as institutions, and we have to work together as a world to ensure that we're addressing the right problems and that we're trying to work on solutions in the right way. So with that, I've given you lots to think on and mull over. I'm sure many of you have strong reactions, at least I'm hoping. And I'm going to open it up to any questions, suggestions, or thoughts you may have. Again, I don't have all the answers. I'm spouting a lot of stuff that I couldn't tell you how to solve today, but I'm incredibly excited to spur some conversation about it in our field. Thanks.